Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. One address, one room, two explanations. In Evans, Colorado, the last minutes of December 31st, 2011 fold into the first minutes of a new year. Inside a modest home on a quiet street, a holiday gathering winds down. The host couple's children are asleep. Guests filter out, the music is low, and what remains is routine domestic silence. Minutes later, that silence is broken by a gunshot. The victim is 28-year-old Ashley Fallis. This first chapter does what detectives do: lock the clock, secure the space, and separate noise from signal. The frame is narrow by design: timestamps, scene access, and who did what within minutes. Everything else waits its turn. Evening of December 31st, 2011. Attendees describe a typical New Year's get-together at the Fallis residence in Evans. Food, drinks, brief conversations, domestic clutter that looks like any end-of-year living room. Nothing in those hours confirms or disproves motive. The value of the pre-midnight window is simple: establish who was there and who left, not why. As the night thins, several guests depart. No reports of strangers arriving. No door kicked in. No window pried. Just after midnight, it is a household again. The master bedroom, bed, nightstands, framed photos, is a closed interior. There are no neighbors on the porch and no unknown car idling outside. The story of what happens next, according to the record, relies on a short timeline, not a long theory. 12:50 a.m., January 1st, 2012. A 911 call is placed from the home. Dispatch logs capture the time. Units roll. EMS is dispatched. Responders arrive within minutes. This is the first fixed anchor in the case: a documented call, a recorded clock, a set of names on an arrival sheet. From here, every claim will be measured against this moment. The first officers do what protocol requires. They secure the hallway. They create a path of travel that reduces contamination risk. Children are moved out of proximity. A quick visual confirms a gunshot wound in the master bedroom where Ashley is down. The firearm is visible. The priority is medical, then preservation. Officers begin basic documentation: overview photographs, body position, the relative placement of items that can be measured later. No judgment about intention is recorded at this stage, only observations that can be mapped. This is a closed domestic scene. According to contemporaneous accounts, there's no forced entry noted. Doors and windows show no fresh damage that would point to an outsider breaking in. Patrol canvasses the immediate perimeter for immediate hazards and witnesses. In this narrow window, between the last guests leaving and the first units arriving, there is no publicly reported surveillance video showing a third party approaching or leaving, and no officer notes describing an unknown subject in flight. That absence is not proof of anything by itself. It is negative evidence to be carried forward and tested against all other sources. As EMS takes over, the scene is held. The camera captures the room from multiple corners, then the details: nightstand surfaces, flooring, lines of travel. What looks like chaos in photographs is ordinary after any sudden medical emergency. Bedding shifted, a light on or off, something knocked off kilter. The initial job is not to interpret, but to lock it in place so later specialists can test angles, distances, and trajectory claims without guessing. The next procedural move is the handoff that every death investigation depends on. After life-saving efforts are exhausted, medical classification begins elsewhere. That is Chapter 2's lane. For now, Chapter 1 ends where first response properly should, on the hard edges of time and control. Before we leave this room, consider the problem investigators face: a short interval with few external witnesses, a private space with measurable geometry, and a single immovable clock, a phone call that arrived at 12:50 a.m. When evidence is thin on entries and exits, the scene and the timeline have to do the heavy lifting. In towns like Evans, crimes don't just break laws, they stress-test procedures. The question isn't what feels likely, it's what the record can carry. With the clock set and the room preserved, the case moves where manner of death is defined: the morgue. The house is sealed. Now the body becomes the second scene. Transport begins under supervision. According to police reports and standard protocol, paramedics transfer custody to law enforcement at the hospital in Greeley-Weld County. Property is inventoried and sealed. Photographs document clothing, injuries visible without manipulation, and any medical interventions already performed. Paperwork lists who touched what, when, and why. Badges, times, signatures. The chain of custody log is the spine here. It tells a clean story, or it doesn't. At the coroner's facility, technicians create a baseline before the first incision. Full body photographs, front and back, measurements of stature and identifying marks. External injuries are documented in situ. Fingernails are clipped or swabbed. Hands can be bagged at the scene. If not, they're protected now to preserve trace. Clothing is dried if wet, then packaged separately to prevent cross-transfer. Every bag receives a unique identifier that must match the custody ledger. If a single number goes missing, defense will find it. That's the rule, and everyone in the room knows it. Radiography follows. A series of X-rays establishes whether there are retained bullet fragments or hidden fractures. For a gunshot death, this step matters. It fixes the presence and position of ballistic material before dissection, which means pathologists aren't forced to rely on memory after tissue is disturbed. Next, high-resolution images of the head and neck, then, if indicated, additional angles for trajectory mapping. None of this is about narrative, it's geometry and metal. External examination notes the gunshot entry, its size and margins, any soot, searing, or stippling that could speak to range of fire. That's where the first interpretive fork appears. Stippling can suggest an intermediate range. Soot and searing can support close contact. But intermediate range signals can be altered by clothing, hair, and movement. The file reflects that these indicators are documented, not dramatized. A voiceover can be compelling without embellishing the physics. Internal examination tracks the wound path. The scalp is reflected, the skull opened, and the temporary cavitation is evaluated along with the permanent track. Pathology records entrance and exit if present, associated fractures, and hemorrhage along the track. Trajectory is described relative to fixed anatomical planes, front to back, left to right, upward or downward. So later courtroom diagrams can reconcile what the jury sees with what the report says. If a bullet or fragments are recovered, they're photographed, measured, and placed into evidence with a new chain of custody line that will eventually point to ballistics. Toxicology is standard in sudden or violent deaths: blood, vitreous, urine. The point isn't moral judgment, it's context that can affect behavior, pain response, or the ability to manipulate a firearm. Results, whatever they show, do not decide manner of death by themselves. They modify probability statements. They don't write conclusions. After the first wave of exams in early January 2012, the Weld County coroner certifies the manner as suicide. According to contemporaneous media and the case record, that certification is reflected on the death certificate. The legal effect is real. Manner of death influences investigative posture, insurance, and public perception. It does not lock the door forever. But for 2012, the administrative status is clear, and Evans police closed their case that spring. This is where voiceover often stumbles, by reading a change in manner as an accusation of malice or incompetence. The better frame is procedural. Manner of death is an administrative conclusion drawn from the best available record at a point in time. When the record expands, the conclusion can change. That's what happens 2 years later. In April 2014, after the case is reopened for outside review by Fort Collins Police Services, the file grows. Investigators collect new witness accounts and revisit prior statements. The coroner revises the manner from suicide to homicide. The text on the death certificate changes. The cause, gunshot wound to the head, remains the same. The manner is the classification of how it happened. To jurors, that distinction matters. To viewers, it should too. One is biology, the other is interpretation. The revision sets off a chain reaction. A new manner can justify warrants, re-interviews, and laboratory consultations on blood stain or range of fire evidence. It can also turbocharge expectations in the public. But science has the same posture before and after a revision. What was measured? What can be replicated? What are the limits? The file indicates contested expert views on bloodstain patterns and wound mechanics would surface later in court. This chapter does not adjudicate them. It establishes that the body, as a scene, was documented by procedure first, then recontextualized by investigators later. There is also the issue of custody integrity. Defense teams will test every handoff, scene to hospital, hospital to coroner, coroner to property room to the crime lab. A mislabeled bag, a broken seal, or a missing photo can undermine an entire inference chain. According to court filings and contemporaneous reporting, the legal fight would later focus less on whether procedures exist and more on how faithfully they were applied, which exhibits were admitted, and which opinions the jury could weigh. That belongs to later chapters. Here, the narrative value is simpler. The body's examination created a record of wounds and potential range findings. The classification on paper moved from suicide to homicide in 2014. Both facts shape everything that follows. A human note kept short. Families live with the words printed on a certificate. Changing one word can feel like reopening a wound. In towns like Evans, crimes aren't just crimes. They stress institutions and households alike. Respecting that is part of telling the story straight. Investigators sometimes say the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. In this file, early alignment, call time, controlled room, a single wound, supported one administrative outcome. Later alignment, new statements, external review, supported another. The work ahead is to test both alignments against materials that don't care about theory, geometry, timestamps, and testimony under oath. With classification on paper and custody intact, attention shifts back to the room. Angles, distances, and trace. The hard math of the master bedroom. After the 12:50 a.m. head anchor, investigators work the master bedroom like a grid. Walls, bed frame, nightstands, closet line, each becomes a fixed reference. Photos move from wide to tight. A scale appears in every close-up. Nothing is left to memory if it can be measured. The firearm is photographed where it rests. Its orientation, proximity to the bed edge, and distance to visible surfaces are logged. A quick diagram notes path of travel lanes inside the room so later analysts can test whether a particular movement is physically possible within seconds. Door and window checks follow. Latch positions, strike plates, and pry points are inspected for fresh damage. According to contemporaneous accounts, no forced entry is documented. Locks are photographed in the positions found. That matters. If an outsider entered, there should be indicators. Tool marks, displaced weather stripping, footprints inconsistent with household shoes. None are reported at this stage. The hallway carpet is screened with oblique lighting. If a drag or heavy scuff existed, it would be marked and cast. No such casting is described in public records. Scene technicians canvass immediately outside the home. Exterior doorknobs and threshold areas are dusted for latent prints only where collection won't destroy potential trace on entry surfaces. Footwear impressions are sought in soft soil or snow runoff. The curb line is scanned for dropped items that could speak to a quick exit. Again, nothing publicly reported places an unknown third party at the house in the minutes bracketing the call. Inside, traces itemized. Swabs are taken from the firearm surfaces, selected touch points on the nightstands, and logical contact areas like the inner doorknob. Each sample is packaged with unique identifiers tied to the scene log to prevent cross-transfer. Fibers on bedding are collected with tape lifts and sealed. If an unexpected fiber type turns up in lab work later, it will have a sealed origin point. That's the point of the paperwork now. Room geometry is recorded in both dimensions and sightlines. Investigators note whether a person standing at the doorway could view the bed surface or whether a partial wall blocks that line. That measurement will matter when testimony speaks to who saw what, from where, and at what angle. A laser rangefinder or tape confirms distances between the muzzle's resting position, the bed, and nearby vertical surfaces that could carry spatter or defects. Technicians mark and photograph any pattern stains or small impact defects on those surfaces. Whether those patterns prove anything will be contested later. Today's job is neutral preservation. The neighborhood canvas asks for exterior cameras. In 2011 to 2012, household CCTV in this area is not widespread, and no publicly released video shows an outsider entering or leaving in the narrow window around the call. That is logged as negative evidence to be weighed against any later witness account. The absence of footage isn't a conclusion. It's a boundary condition for the story the evidence can tell. To keep context human and fair, investigators note routine domestic details without overreading them. Framed photos not perfectly level, a lamp switched on, a drawer partially open. On television, those become instant symbols. In a real file, they are measured, photographed, and left for experts and a jury to interpret with the rest of the record. With the room mapped, entry points documented, and trace sealed, the file moves from geometry to movement. What phones, dispatch logs, and carrier records can show about who was awake, calling, or traveling when minutes mattered. With the physical scene mapped, investigators turned to what the clocks and systems could prove. The 911 call at 12:50 a.m. set the anchor. GAD logs and radio traffic confirmed officers and EMS arrived within minutes. That digital trail left little room for dispute on when help reached the Fallis home. Carrier records gave investigators call detail and sector hits. In 2012, cell site data was the standard, not GPS. The records confirmed the devices in question were consistent with being at the Evans residence. No evidence surfaced of outside movement in the narrow window before police entry. Neighborhood canvassing for cameras came up empty. No video showed anyone approaching or leaving. Investigators noted that as a negative result, it narrowed possibilities but did not prove absence. Text messages from around midnight were reviewed. Preserved threads were compared with testimony, though one interview note was later reported missing, limiting precision. Financial checks showed no unusual late-night activity tied to planning. Together, the digital and financial layers showed no external approach, no procurement trail, and a single confirmed anchor: the 911 call. Digital records can anchor a story, but they cannot explain what happened inside the room. That's why the next step pressed on the people involved, their words against the clock. As digital records narrowed the frame, investigators shifted to the words of those inside the Evans home that night. Statements often bridge the silence left by data, but they must align with the hard timeline already set. In early interviews, Tom Fallis told officers that Ashley had taken her own life. His account referenced the minutes before the gunshot, describing a heated argument that ended abruptly. Detectives compared his statement against preserved phone logs and radio timestamps. No outgoing calls or messages were made from Ashley's phone in that window, a negative evidence point that gave weight to the digital silence. Party guests who had celebrated New Year's Eve in the same house offered varying recollections. Some recalled raised voices, others only confusion after the shot. These memories were logged but marked preliminary until tested against time-stamped police arrival and EMS reports. Officers noted that statements grew less consistent as hours passed, a common but significant factor when alcohol was present. One neighbor reported hearing a single loud crack, but no signs of struggle before it. That testimony was labeled working, valuable but requiring correlation with physical findings. Detectives also reviewed dispatch audio. Background noise captured during the 911 call hinted at overlapping voices, though clarity was debated. The process revealed a core problem in many domestic crime investigations. Words can contradict each other as easily as they align. Inconsistencies did not point directly to guilt, but shaped the scope of what prosecutors could argue. Each statement became a puzzle piece, some fitting cleanly, others bending under scrutiny. What viewers should take away is that testimony, no matter how emotional or confident, is only as strong as its connection to physical or digital anchors. That lesson becomes more important as the focus shifts from statements to how investigators looked for signs of preparation or planning. From words to actions, investigators turned to whether anything was acquired, prepared, or staged before the 12:50 a.m. SAR call. Receipts and bank activity were reviewed across the short run-up to New Year's. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, no late-night purchases of tools, firearm parts, or unusual supplies surfaced. Credit and debit histories showed routine holiday spending, not a pre-event procurement trail. Where retail checks were possible, investigators compared timestamps to carrier logs to see if anyone left the Evans residence to buy something just before. Nothing documented shows a last-minute run. In a domestic crime with minutes between argument and gunshot, the absence of a shopping footprint mattered. It set a ceiling on claims of elaborate planning. Surveillance queries produced the same constraint. Investigators asked nearby businesses for camera coverage that could show a vehicle departing and returning close to midnight. No publicly released footage captured such a trip. That result did not prove intent either way, but it narrowed scenario building to items already inside the home. Weapon access was treated as a feasibility problem, not a character judgment. Investigators documented where the household firearm was typically stored, who knew its location, and whether ammunition was kept separately. Chain of custody entries from the scene circled back to storage practices. Could a person retrieve the firearm in seconds, or would it have required a search that others would likely notice? The practical answer leaned toward immediacy. Nothing official indicates a long hunt through closets or locked containers in the minutes preceding the call. Planning can also look like premeditated concealment, throwaway phones, staged alibis, scheduled travel. Carrier subpoenas and airline hotel checks looked for those tells. Public accounts from the later court record do not show burner activity, booked flights, or hotel reservations aligned to a planned aftermath. Financials lacked large withdrawals suggesting cash prep for flight. After the gunshot, responders encountered the household as is. There was no documented attempt to leave before first units arrived within minutes. That post-incident behavior isn't proof of anything by itself, but it undermined certain theories of a pre-planned homicide followed by immediate escape. Medical and pharmaceutical angles were reviewed for coercive preparation, sedatives, impairing prescriptions, or sudden refills. No publicly reported toxicology or pharmacy data in this case established a pre-event drugging plan. Toxicology remained contextual, not dispositive. It could inform behavior but did not flip the manner of death question on its own. Feasibility then narrowed to seconds. Could a person in a small bedroom move from an argument to a firearm, chamber a round if needed, and discharge it before anyone in the living areas could intervene? Geometry from the scene mapping, distances, sightlines, and dispatch timing suggested there was very little opportunity for third-party movement without detection. That's why procurement was largely an internal inventory assessment, what was already in reach, rather than a hunt for outside purchases that never appeared in records. The human point is simple and sober. When planning evidence is thin, investigators must resist filling gaps with speculation. They weigh what is on paper, receipts, cameras, logs, and accept the limits. The feasibility matrix here did not deliver intent. It delivered boundaries. Those boundaries shaped the next move, charging decisions, and the interagency steps that followed the 2014 review. With procurement ruled sparse and opportunity confined to a short window, the file advanced to charging theory. Who brought the revised manner to court, what evidence survived gatekeeping, and how jurisdictions coordinated the next phase. Once feasibility was mapped, the file advanced to whether a criminal charge could be sustained. By 2012, Evans police closed the incident as a probable suicide. But 2 years later, in 2014, Weld County District Attorney's Office revisited the file after a neighbor's testimony surfaced, describing alleged admissions overheard that night. That statement prompted a fresh charging theory. If physical evidence was inconclusive, could testimonial and circumstantial elements support probable cause for a homicide charge? Interagency cooperation became central. Local police forwarded the archive materials to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, for technical review. CBI re-examined ballistic trajectories and scene photos, checking for alignment with either self-inflicted discharge or third-party involvement. According to court filings, their assessment did not deliver a definitive forensic contradiction, but prosecutors believed the testimonial evidence tipped the scales enough to justify a grand jury. In November 2014, a Weld County grand jury convened. Jurors heard from neighbors, family members, and investigators. The body weighed whether Tom Fallis's post-incident statements, described as spontaneous, overheard confessions by neighbors, could establish intent. They returned an indictment for second-degree murder, showing how testimonial weight can move a stalled case forward, even when physical markers remain contested. Execution of the indictment involved another interagency chain. Evans PD, Weld County Sheriff's Office, and CBI coordinated the arrest. Reports note Tom Fallis was taken into custody at his new residence outside Colorado, highlighting the geographic span of coordination once a sealed indictment was unsealed. The interagency role was not only investigative but logistical, ensuring arrest warrants were executed cleanly without jurisdictional conflict. Charging theory also faced the filter of prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors had to decide whether the combination of neighbor testimony, perceived inconsistencies in statements, and contested forensic interpretation was strong enough to present to a jury. Critics argued that elevating testimonial fragments above physical inconclusiveness risked undermining the standard of proof. Supporters countered that in domestic settings, witness accounts often become the only available window when scenes are ambiguous. This stage demonstrated how crime files evolve not only on evidence, but on shifts in prosecutorial risk appetite, community pressure, and the willingness of interagency teams to revisit a closed conclusion. The arrest itself marked a pivot in the narrative. from a case written off as a suicide to one formally treated as potential homicide. The next chapter would address what happened in the courtroom, where motions, admissibility fights, and expert witnesses would decide whether the charge survived scrutiny. By March 2016, the case against Tom Fallis entered its final stage in a Colorado courtroom. Prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to test every piece of evidence under the strict rules of admissibility. The judge ruled that the jury could consider not only second-degree murder but also lesser charges such as reckless manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide, widening the range of possible outcomes. Central to the prosecution's case was the testimony of a teenage neighbor who claimed he overheard Tom say, "I shot my wife," in the moments after the gun discharged. The defense attacked this account as unreliable, pointing out distance, noise, and the years that had passed before the statement surfaced. Experts were brought in to analyze blood patterns and firearm positioning, but the conclusions were contested, with each side presenting their own interpretation of the scene. Questions about investigative integrity also reached the jury. An Evans police supervisor admitted to destroying his handwritten notes after typing a report, a routine practice at the time, but one that left gaps for cross-examination. This became a point of contention, allowing the defense to argue that the investigation lacked transparency and consistency. The coroner's original finding of suicide was highlighted as evidence of early uncertainty, while prosecutors countered that later review by investigators and a grand jury presented a fuller picture. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof remained at the center. The state had to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for fewer than 4 hours. On March 31, 2016, the verdict was delivered. Not guilty. Tom Fallis was acquitted of all charges. For Ashley Fallis's family, the outcome brought no closure. She was only 28, a mother of 3, and her sudden death left enduring pain. The trial showed how fragile criminal cases can become when evidence is divided between disputed testimony and inconclusive forensics. Acquitted. Tom Fallis was found not guilty of second-degree murder on March 31, 2016. This case continues to be remembered as a cautionary lesson in domestic crime investigations, where precise documentation, careful handling of witness accounts, and the standard of proof can mean the difference between conviction and acquittal. It leaves us to reflect. In situations where facts and memory collide, how should the justice system balance fairness with accountability? As I close this story, I can't help but reflect on how fragile justice can feel in a crime like this. One life was lost, another forever marked, and a family left with questions that will never fully be answered. What I take from Ashley's case is a reminder: evidence matters, but so do the voices of those who speak up early when it can still make a difference. For anyone listening, it's a call to value your own safety, to seek help, and to trust that your life has worth. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think the system worked the way it should have here? Or do you see gaps that should never be repeated? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from or why this story hit home for you. And if this video connected with you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next case, the next lesson, and the next chance to talk about the real issues that affect all of us.